Speaker, this government's character flaws have been abundantly illustrated in the budget. When the government is not robbing Peter to pay Paul, it's transferring money from people's right pocket to their left and congratulating itself for cleverness. Little in this budget is quite what it seems. The $1.5 billion in new mental health money is offset by a $580 million cut in Medicare psychologist consultations. For all the focus on the forecast surplus, there's been virtually no net tightening of the fiscal position since the middle of last year. For all the talk of repaying debt, the actual budget bills increased the government's borrowing limit by another $50 billion. The government has cut funding for defence and national security while massively increasing funding to manage illegal boat people. The disability pensioner participation changes mostly apply to people under 35, so largely miss the musculoskeletal problems that keep so many older people on welfare. And even the headline-hogging efforts to get teenage mums into work and delinquent parents to send their kids to school are trials only. Mr Speaker, tradies might get their new utes cheaper, but running them will be much more expensive thanks to FBT increases. Government will spend $350 on each pensioner's set-top box when Jerry Harvey can supply and install them for just $168. Perhaps this program should be called Building the Entertainment Revolution. Mr Speaker, pensioners and self-funded retirees deserve better than this. The Prime Minister used to say that detaining boat people on Pacific Islands was costly, unsustainable and wrong in principle. Yet last Friday she announced that government would try to reopen Manus Island. She used to insist that boat people couldn't be sent to Nauru because Nauru wasn't a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees. But last Saturday she announced that 800 boat people would be sent to Malaysia, which isn't a signatory either, and that 4,000 of Malaysia's arrivals would come here. The policy is no longer to stop the boats, but to swap the boats, at a budget cost of nearly $70,000 a person, or more than 10 times the cost of a Sydney-Kuala Lumpur first-class air ticket. So, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister should finally pick up the phone to the President of Nauru and reintroduce all the Howard policies that stopped the boats. And if she wanted to value add, with the Coalition's support, she would introduce mandatory 10-year minimum sentences for people smugglers. But, Mr Speaker, make no mistake, whatever she does, a coalition government will stop the boats. So, Mr Speaker, whether it's installing and removing roof bats that catch fire, building overpriced school halls, losing control of our borders and detention centres, needlessly digging up people's front yards, threatening to kill the mining boom with an investment-destroying new tax, or imposing a carbon tax that won't clean up the environment but will clean out people's wallets, this government always has the same basic failing. It tries to solve problems it doesn't understand, refuses to listen to people with good advice, and thinks that if it changes the subject, people won't notice its mistakes. It makes announcements and moves on without the hard work that's needed to turn creating a headline into making a difference. Typically, while the carbon tax is not in the budget, the carbon tax ad campaign most certainly is. The mining tax is in the budget too, even though its details have yet to be finalised or enacted into law, and it's supposed to start on the very same day as the carbon tax. Well, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister can leave the carbon tax out of the budget, but she can't hide the damage it will do to struggling families' cost of living, the havoc it will wreak on jobs in manufacturing industry exposed to cutthroat competition, and the fact that it will make no real difference to the environment in the absence of comparable action overseas. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister can't hide the truth that this is a tax for which she has no mandate. In fact, she has a mandate not to introduce it. The declaration, "There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead," will haunt this government every day until it faces up to this betrayal. Now, Mr Speaker, does anyone think that the Prime Minister would now be in the lodge had she admitted truthfully 6 days out from last year's election that, yes, there will be a carbon tax under the government I lead? Mr Speaker, this is the cancer that's eroding the Prime Minister's standing and sapping this government's authority. As things stand, we have a parliament that can't make decisions people respect, a Prime Minister who looks like she's not up to the job, and a minority government that's increasingly seen as an experiment that's failed. And, Mr Speaker, if Australia goes on like this for another 2.5 years, what is currently a great country with a lousy government could slide into a complete morass of indecision and paralysis. This government lacks legitimacy, not because it lacks a majority, but because it lacks integrity. And this is what should gnaw at the consciences of MPs, even those who support the carbon tax. How can, Mr Speaker, how can this parliament honourably decide to introduce a carbon tax when no fewer than 144 of the House of Representatives' 150 members are in parties that were committed not to have one? Now, Mr Speaker, people are entitled to change their minds, but national leaders can't on something as important as a great big new tax on everything unless they first validate that change by seeking a new mandate at an election. Mr Speaker, on this subject, the Prime Minister has compared herself with John Howard and the GST. But there is one fundamental difference between them. The former Prime Minister changed his policy and put the new position to an election. The current Prime Minister had an election on one policy and promptly adopted the opposite one. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister should copy John Howard, not just quote him. She and Bob Brown should finalise the carbon tax details, including its impact on jobs, industries and Australians' cost of living, and then she should seek the people's verdict before trying to legislate it. Otherwise, Mr Speaker, the next election won't just be a referendum on the carbon tax, it will be a referendum on governments that betray their people. So, Mr Speaker, that's what Australia needs, not a carbon tax, but an election. Only an election could make an honest politician of this Prime Minister. Only an election can give Australia a government with authority to make the tough decisions needed to build a stronger country and to help Australians get ahead.
The debate is adjourned. The House